Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Graham Robertson, and I'm standing in tonight for the President of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, Professor Dr. Zhang, who's unfortunately for me is in China at the moment. Welcome to this event. Before I start the event, I would like to make a statement that it is the tradition of the University of Western Australia to acknowledge that this university is situated on Noongar land, and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. The Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering is absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Institute of Advanced Studies of UWA. Each year, the Academy appoints or elects an eminent speaker, and this person is chosen because of their outstanding ability to communicate their science and knowledge. As part of the program, the eminent speaker talks at public lectures to groups of high school students who are studying science. But one of the highlights each year is that the Institute of Advanced Studies is very kindly co-hosts this meeting with us to present to a combined audience of regulars of the Institute's meetings and fellows of the Academy of Technology and Engineering. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Meeuwig to you. And I should just have a slight stop here. That I actually believe that I left my glasses behind, so I've got this pair out of the boot of the car. So they're a little old. So apologies to Jessica, not to you, because you won't know the difference. Jessica is Professor of Marine Science at the University of Western Australia. She grew up in Saudi Arabia, and she obtained a scuba diving licence or certificate when she was 15. And this gave her a very close view of marine life from an early age. It's not surprising then that she trained as a marine scientist, as a marine biologist, I should say. Jessica has worked in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the Baltic, where I'm sure the water's cooler, Canada, and now Australia for the last 18 years. Her research group, the Marine Futures Lab, focuses on conservation-driven research with particular attention on the role that highly protected marine parks can play in rebuilding healthy, resilient ocean systems. The research group has pioneered the development and use of mid-water weighted remote underwater video systems, which allows them to understand what is actually there and what it is doing, with a particular emphasis on the large species in open ocean. These species include tuna, sharks, marine mammals, and this allows us to better understand how the marine system should and could work. Jessica's efforts for our oceans have been widely acknowledged. She's been a finalist in the West Australian Science Communicator of the Year, and you will soon find out why that was the case. A finalist for West Australian of the Year in 2017, and now she's the 2019 Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering Eminent Speaker. She's a strong communicator and advocate for oceans. Jessica believes that sharing research knowledge is fundamental to our collective efforts to create flourishing oceans. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Jessica to you this evening.
Okay, how's my volume at the back? All right? Okay, so tonight what I'm going to do is first depress you. Then I'm going to dangle a solution. Then I'm going to share some of the research that we've been doing. And I will end up by coming back to the importance of community in saving our oceans. But before I depress you, I thought I would share with you a video that's from our early work on reefs and shallow habitats. And it's a little bit of fun, and it is a reminder of why we should love our oceans and why we biologists do.
Pardon me. Do you mind using the microphone?
I'll speak louder.
You only keep that up for about 5 seconds.
I promise. So I wanted to start with a bit of fun. How's that? Yeah. Is that all right?
Much better.
And I have a very clear Canadian accent as well. So I wanted to start with that because the next slide, first I have to tell you about the blue marble. So basically, it's a good reminder that we live on a blue planet, 71% of the surface area, but 99% of the habitable volume of our planet is water. It determines our weather, it slows the effects of climate change, it feeds us. 15 to 40% of our diet comes from seafood, and 43 million people are employed. It produces, Sting nearly got it right, every breath we take, and that's every second breath we take comes from the ocean. And Australia's ocean-dependent industries are expected to generate $125 billion in just 6 years from now. So this is the problem. How many people here were born after 1996? Stand up if you were born after 1996. I see 2. All right, well, we're not doing a good enough job of attracting young people into marine science then. But you guys, you can sit down now, you've never known an ocean where catches were going up. Since 1996, catches have decreased globally every year. And 33% of our global fisheries are unsustainable. Now imagine if 33% of your bridges fell down. Like, that wouldn't be really good bridge building. And we're losing literally tens of billions globally from economies because every year we lose about 1 billion kilograms. And I wrote that in honor of Clive Palmer when he said he was 1,000 million or something. Anyway, so go Clive. And it's not, and it also is for species that we really care about. And the reason I put up this slide is our tuna biomass has decreased by 60% since 1955. And make no mistake, that is not just from commercial fishing. That also includes recreational fishing, and it includes the tuna ranching that we call aquaculture, that is basically just fattening pens for tuna in South Australia. And the big problem is that fish have nowhere to hide. In the 1950s, you can see the red areas were where most of our fishing effort was concentrated, but with bigger boats, more sophisticated methods of fishing, basically we spread out in the 2000s to almost the entire globe. There are very few places that are no longer fished, including in Antarctica and the Arctic. You can see now that the entire west coast of Africa is fished heavily. And that brings us to another outcome that we seldom think about around overfishing. No fish drives poverty, poverty drives modern slavery. And this is an increasing scourge in our fishing industries, and we should be thinking not only about sustainability of what we eat, but about how it was caught. So what about Australia? World's best managed fisheries. And before I say too much about fisheries, I do want to start by saying I think fisheries managers have a really tough job. Imagine you're working in forest management. First thing you have to do is count the trees, or you can't see the fish. Then you have to work out the species of trees that you have, how fast they grow, how long they live. Again, we can't see the fish. We have to rely on remote sensing or catching them to understand what's in our ocean. And moreover, despite the ocean being 73% of our planet, 71%, it attracts very little of the funding for research. So poor fisheries managers have their hands absolutely tied behind their back in terms of doing an effective job of managing these fisheries. So even in Australia, where we have lots of resources, 30% of our large fish have disappeared in the last 10 years. Over 20% of our fisheries managed by the Commonwealth Government are unsustainable. 74 to 92% of our sharks in Queensland, coastal sharks, like tiger sharks, have disappeared in 5 years, and that's primarily due to netting.
5 years or 5 decades?
Sorry, 5 decades. Thank you, York. This is why I like the other thing. Anyway, Western Australia has not escaped this. There are a number of our iconic species that are in trouble. In 2009, the State Department of Fisheries cut the catch of jewfish and other demersal fish by 50% because they were being overfished. In 2014, they had to cut the catch of herring bag limits by 50%. How do you mess up herring? They're small and they grow fast. And then we've just recently this year had concerns expressed about green lip abalone, which means that the commercial catches are being slashed by almost 70%. And the western rock lobster. So for those of you who don't know about rock lobster, basically what happens is the young go offshore, they spend months at sea, they come back, and they turn into what look like little tiny translucent rock lobsters. That's called a curulus, which is, oh no, so curulus lobster, and they settle on the reefs. Now Fisheries, very cleverly, has these settlement collectors where the baby rock lobsters land on them, and then they can predict the catch 4 years hence. So what we've seen at all the places where we're monitoring them in Australis, this is the curve before 2000 when the rock lobster crashed. This is the curve ever since in terms of cumulative settlement. So we're at 67% down from where we were pre-crash. Same at Dongara is a little bit better, that's the best one, 24%. Warnbro in the center is 80%, or in the south is 80% down, and Jurien is 56% down. And if you weight that overall, the number of baby lobsters that are recruiting to this coast are less than half of what they were before the entire stock crashed. And we're slow learners. I had no idea that they'd already documented in the mid-1800s that fish populations were crashing. So this, by 1920s, flathead over east had completely crashed, and 100 years later, it's still only at 40% of what it was at the turn of the previous century. 100 years later. So, in response to the fact that conventional fisheries management has failed to prevent the decline of major fish stocks, and certainly is slow at rebuilding them, there's been the rise of large marine parks around the world. So these yellow blobs are all the large, over 10,000 square kilometer marine parks in the world. And they're mostly blue water. We've also had the first multinational high seas marine park that was established in the Antarctic, the Ross Sea, which is 1.5 million square kilometers, largely no take. So all these yellow blobs. So if I say to you, can you fish in the marine park? How many people say, yes, you can? All right, so most people aren't saying yes. Well, guess what, you can. So all of these marine parks are basically a mosaic of full protection and partial protection. And globally, we've got about 4.8% of our ocean in some sort of mixed-use marine park, and only 2.2% that is fully protected, which is well short of the 2020 IHC target of having 10% of protection in our oceans. So why marine parks? So there's 30 years of evidence on why marine parks are good for oceans. Started in New Zealand, where apparently many, many good things come from. And there's a guy named Bill Valentine who proposed to have a small marine park in the 1970s on one of their reefs. And everybody said, "Nah, mate, why would you have a marine park? The fish will just swim out," right? And he rightly said, well, if they'll swim out, you can catch them over there, right? But anyway, he persevered, and they got the first marine park. And then following that, there were a number of other marine parks that were set up. And gradually what we learned is that when you close areas to fishing, not only do you get higher biodiversity, you get more fish, they're bigger, and the most important fish in the ocean are the big fat females, by the way, that you get fisheries benefits because as numbers accumulate inside the marine park, they spill over. What we didn't expect, but we also found, is that areas that aren't fished are more resilient. So on the Great Barrier Reef, where you have areas closed to fishing, they recover faster from coral bleaching. They have fewer outbreaks of crowns of thorns. They recover faster from flooding. So these are actually resilient, and we're not exactly sure why, but they work. We've also learned about important ecological processes, for instance, the role of tiger sharks in maintaining healthy seagrass beds. Seagrass beds store carbon. Sharks keep seagrass beds healthy because they keep down the grazers. Healthy oceans need healthy sharks. So the question then really is, will the Big Blue follow suit? Now the first large offshore marine park was only established in 2010 by the UK government. So we don't actually have a long time series to look at benefits. Then the other challenge is that we had no idea how to sample them. And I'm going to come to that. So the big question is, when you have a Big Blue marine park, post-park, are you going to get more fish, bigger fish, higher diversity, recovery of endangered species such as sharks? And will they spill over? So this is a little insight into what we do in my lab. So what we've been developing is these mid-water baited remote underwater video systems, and it's basically 2 GoPros on a stick with a bait canister. Cheap and easy. And that's what they look like when you're looking down on them in the water. We've taken these GoPros and gone all over the planet, 52 expeditions in 37 countries in 7 years, which is why my hair is so gray. And literally we've counted over 100,000 individuals and identified these fish without having to kill them. That's the important part. And we've been working heavily around Western Australia. It's not glamorous being a marine biologist. I have a very committed team. And effectively what we do is we throw the camera in the water, and we spend a lot of time looking at blue ocean because open ocean species are rare and low naturally, but they do come by. And so we see everything from schooling fish to endangered hammerheads, and it really gives us a glimpse in terms of what's down there. And for every single one of these animals, we identify it, we count them, and we measure their length. And what that does is gives us the first quantitative understanding of what oceans actually look like. We've yet to see a dolphin actually get rid of, manage to steal one of our bait canisters, but they sure do try. All right, so that's basically, and this is really important because you can go snorkeling on a coral reef, but how do you get an understanding of what's out there? And it's absolutely beautiful. Okay, we'll go on. So how do we do this? I apparently own more GoPros than anybody else in the Southern Hemisphere. 268 because somebody just flooded one, too. So basically, the GoPros are the core, and the reason I flag this is previously when I first started working with baited remote underwater video systems, we had to use Sony Handycams, and they're bloody expensive, right? So you were really constrained in how much sampling that you can do. But when you're in the open ocean, and everything's rare and there aren't that many, you have to be able to sample intensively. So cheap technology has been our savior. Although they never donate any, they're horrible. Basically then you need a boat. Because we're cheap and easy and flexible, we can work on everything from small 10-meter rigs right up to industrial, vessels, commercial vessels, and occasionally we get to go for a jolly on a nice yacht. But when you're covered in bait, it doesn't really matter. Once you're out in the field, this gives you an idea more closely what the bruvs look like. There's the bait canister, the 2 GoPros. This is an environmental sensor that looks at oxygen, sea surface temperature, pH, and temperature. Floats and bait canister, and it basically goes in off the back of the boat, and it creates a permanent record for that sample. And in order to avoid losing lots of them, we deploy them in long lines of 5, because it's easier to recover, which is also why we've got the little antennae on the top. All right, so as I mentioned, we count and identify and count. So this is the first step. We've got customized software. You bring the video back to the lab. Video runs. Every time you see a fish, you put a little dot on it, fill out a little box, and you say, aha, a scalloped hammerhead, or a marlin, or a flying fish. And then the next step is to count them. And yes, each of those red dots is a fish. So one of my committed analysts, committable maybe, has counted each and every one of those fish, and I think there are, I need my glasses, 164 of them. So for every species in a sample, we know how many there were, and then the final step is to measure them. And effectively, we're now using the stereo nature of the cameras, because if you don't have stereo, you can't tell if it's something really big far away or really small close up, right? So we need stereo. So you click on the nose and the tail of the fish in each frame, and it tells you exactly how big it is, down to millimeters, and exactly how far away it is from the cameras. And we can do that for both the easy ones. This guy's about 75 centimeters long, 75.3 to be precise. And if I remember the error, it was plus or minus 0.6 centimeters. But we also do all the lilies, so this guy's 3 centimeters long and over a meter away from the cameras. So if you were dragging a net through the ocean, you'd miss all the small fish, so you wouldn't really know what the ecosystem structure looks like. And if you were doing acoustics, you wouldn't ping those small fish. And so this really gives us the most comprehensive picture we have of what's under that blue curtain. But really, we're moving towards automation because all of my team would rather be in the field than staring at blue water in the lab. There's making great strides to be able to automate image analysis so that we can really scale up this whole technique, and we're working on that as well with colleagues overseas. So I mentioned we've done quite a few locations, so this is our big map from the last 6 years. And just to confirm, it's not all hard work. I think this is the only picture of somebody surfing in Tristan da Cunha. So what have we learned from all of this? With our global data, we've been able to look, for instance, at what are the last strongholds for sharks. So on this map, what we've done is we've modeled our bruvs data against information like, where's the nearest port? How deep is the water? What's the water temperature? How productive it is? And you put all those independent variables together and say, okay, so where do you expect the sharks to be? Sadly, the most important variable is distance from port. So the closer you are to the port, the fewer sharks you have. So here you can see that the red dots are the areas that are really these last thresholds. And throughout, for instance, the Pacific, where there should be lots of sharks, not so many, and that's fishing. You can also use this information to say, okay, so I've got money to establish a marine park. You could put it where there are no sharks left and hope they'll come back. Or you could put it where there still are sharks, and you can protect those last populations of these long-lived, slow-growing species. So it also helps in terms of designing parks. Critical habitats. So we don't know very much about oceanic animals, especially sharks. We don't know where they breed. We don't know where they pup. We don't know where their nurseries are. So for instance, for coastal sharks, we know that areas in Ningaloo are really important as nurseries, but in the open ocean we don't. So this was kind of a bit of fun. This is a short fin mako, which is a vulnerable, endangered species. The yellow dots are where we never saw one. The red dots are where we saw adults. And the green dots are where we saw babies. And these babies were 50, 60, and 70 centimeters in size. The only place we ever saw them was the West Australian coast, and they are literally newly pupped. Absolutely amazing. And again, this is something that we can do with our video. So if you think about what are areas that should be protected, nurseries are pretty high up on that list, and now we know where some of them are. We can also set baselines. So one of the challenges we have in oceans is something called shifting baselines. We all forget that you used to be able to catch heaps of Jewfish around Rottnest, right? Not that long ago. But young people think you catch a Jewfish in 30 meters of water, or 40 meters of water. So these shifting baselines makes it really hard for us to understand the change that our oceans are undergoing. So what we now have here is a quantitative measure of species richness, abundance, and biomass. We know how variable they are, and we can then ask, well, if that stays open to fishing, is it going to go down? Does it go down through time? If we protect it, does it go up? We can also understand Australia in the context of other locations. So the red bars are Australia. That's Montebello's. Must have been something about that nuclear testing. There's such high species richness up there. And this one, I'll draw your attention to, is Geograph Bay. Lowest biomass we saw anywhere in Australia, which is nuts because it's in a coastal embayment with, you know, nutrients running in. It should be absolutely hopping.
What's the horizontal axis? What's the horizontal axis?
Sites. So each one of those is a location, but you wouldn't have been able to see all the small text. Same as this horizontal axis. So we've also really focused in on Western Australia. On the right, you see all the marine parks labeled 2 to 11. These are the Commonwealth marine parks that have been set up. Various combinations of partial protection and full protection. And we've gone to all of those as well, and we can now start building those baselines. So coming down from the northwest, you can see, in this case, it's the number of different taxa that we saw. Again, it pops up in the center area, and I think this is because we've got a combination of tropical and subtropical species there. And then as you come down onto the south coast from Perth south, taxonomic richness is actually pretty low, which is not all that surprising. Tropics tend to be more rich than southern areas. So just to give you a taste of, what we see here, this is mostly from the Perth Canyon, and the last friend that will be introduced is from Geograph Bay, one of the few animals we saw. So literally, Perth Canyon is this hopping, you know, it's got whales and sharks and small fish, and we've now done 6 expeditions there, and we always see the same thing. It is absolutely hopping, including the little babies like that one. That would have been Francine, she's been nicknamed. She's about 60.9 centimeters, which means she was probably born within that month of observation. And the great thing again is we get a picture of the entire community, including the important forage species that are at the base of the food web. And then, because this is my favorite, this is Sweetie, she's been nicknamed. I can tell you where we saw her, Geograph Bay, but well offshore. But she was very determined, and she spent a lot of time focusing on our big canister. The only one we ever lost, and she lost it too, and then she needed a toothpick. People don't accept the fact that marine parks work in coastal areas means they'll probably work in the offshore. So we're constantly facing a battle to get good protection. So in the same way that we have to show coastally that following protection you get higher diversity, higher abundance, bigger fish, we're now going to have to do the same thing in the oceans. But in the open ocean. But what we do know is that effective MPAs are no take. That means there is no fishing. Well enforced, so you need compliance. They're at least 10 years old. They're large, isolated. And the best evidence we have from scientists is that they should cover 30% of the bioregions as no take. So, Australia's paper parks. The left panel is the complete network. The outer boundaries are each of the parks, and the colors inside are the zoning. On the right, you see the no-take, right? That's the only stuff that counts, actually. But on the left, we have these big paper parks with all this partial protection. And when did your sex ed teacher ever tell you that partial protection worked? Close your ears. It doesn't work. It does not work. Right? So the problem is we've got these habitat protection zones where you can't touch the bottom, but you can fish throughout the water column. And when the bottom's 3,000 meters deep, you know, how's that going to work for us? So we need to be really careful, and you know, I'm going to encourage everybody to be loud and noisy about the fact that we need better protection and it's not partial. So I mentioned Geograph Bay before, showing that it's got no fish. This is the zoning for Geograph Bay from the Commonwealth Government. And you can see that out of that entire area, only 1.5% of it is fully protected. And the rest is all that lovely partial protection. No more jokes about sex ed teachers. So, you know, this isn't going to work. And people are going to look, 10 years from now, they're going to say, hey, we spent a lot of money on managing this area and we didn't get any conservation outcomes. Well, duh, you know, it wasn't protected. And the state has done only marginally better. So this is in state waters, which is now the Ngari Marine Park, and there's about 9% that's fully protected. But basically the vast majority of this very special bay that currently has hardly any fish in it is not going to be protected going into the future. And it is a long, slow road. So this is an article from the West back in 2009, quoting me, saying, hey, we need large, fully protected marine parks. And what I find ironic about it is that in 2009 there were fears for herring, and in 2014 it came true, right? That they had to cut catches by half. So, where did this all go wrong? It was a Dutchman, Hugo de Groot. And I can say rude things about Dutch people because I'm half Dutch, Meeuwig. Anyway, Hugo de Groot. De Groot means the big. And he certainly was a man with big ideas. And was very well respected. And he basically came up with the doctrine of mare liberum, which meant free seas. And he was arguing that the seas were so limitless that everybody should have access to them, right? Not just for navigation, but also for fisheries. And that's where it started. Now, it's worth noting that at the time, the Dutch and the Portuguese were having a stoush over the East India trade, with the Portuguese saying, no, 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 you can't come in here. This is our place. And Meneer de Groot was actually working as a commercial counsel to the Dutch East Indies Company, and so he said, no, 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 the sea is limitless, and he won the argument. So we ended up with this philosophy for the next 350 years that the seas were limitless. Oops, oh no, I blew it. So, and that was until 1982, when the United Nations Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, came in, and that's what established 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones around all maritime countries, which allows a country like Australia to control its waters out to 200 nautical miles. And it gives us the privilege of putting partial protected areas in our EEZ instead of fully protected ones. So we're really still, the reason I wanted to go down the historical route is because that mare liberum has framed all of our thinking about the oceans, and it still infects us today, where we still think that West Australia's waters are limitless, and that there's heaps of herring, there's heaps of jewies, there's heaps of lobsters, and there's not. So we need to move beyond limitless seas. It's my favorite. Every time I show this, the whole room goes. So, let's go again, go again. You're supposed to loop. Do it again. So this is heartbreaking, but it was also considered entirely reasonable, right? Entirely reasonable in Queensland in the 1960s. And again, we're slow learners, because currently we think this is entirely reasonable. That you go down to the beach, you burley up, and you skull drag a threatened species up onto the beach, take a selfie, and then release it. And of course it swims away happily, because you released it. You might notice there's a wee bit of blood around here. So, oh, that's not me, thank goodness. These need to sneeze for some water. So the point is that we have to really think differently about how we use the oceans, right? And a colleague of mine, Graham Edgar, the one who published the paper showing that 30% of big fish have disappeared in a decade, he was quoted as saying, 10 years from now, fishermen are going to be kicking themselves, absolutely kicking themselves that they didn't get behind and support marine protected areas. Fully protected ones, not this partial protection nonsense. So, because we have to end on a highlight. How many people who know who Josh Brolin is, the actor? Please, a couple of you. Yeah, okay, yeah. Good. Anyway, the first time I saw this photograph, or this type of imagery, was Greta Scacchi, the Australian soapy actress, and she had this beautiful fish draped in front of her, and I thought, well, good on you. But because I'd rather not objectify women's bodies, I found this one. And, but I think it makes the point that we have to think all of our voices matter, right? And 20 years ago, you would not have ever seen a celebrity saying, hey, oceans matter, right? And the fact that Miley Cyrus has now said she wasn't going to have children with Liam Hemsworth until there are more fish in the sea. Apparently that's a tragedy, that we need more fish in the sea so that Liam Hemsworth and Miley Cyrus reproduce. But you know, I'll work with that. But the reason I put this up is that unless we have visibility of what is essentially invisible, we won't even see it. Our oceans will just die. And I'm not overstating that, right? And we all know that politicians don't lead, right? They follow. So the only way we're going to get change for our oceans and get rid of these ridiculous, partially protected marine parks that we pretend are doing something for our oceans is if all of you lot get noisy. Okay. So now we're going to, because this should be about participation, and I'm testing if anybody was paying attention to what I said. I'm going to share with you one by one the key arguments against marine parks that I get, and y'all are going to tell me the answer, and then I'm going to tell you mine. So the first one is, you don't need marine parks because fisheries are well managed. So what would you respond to that? So where did all the fish go, right? Where are they if they're so well managed? The fish will just swim out. Response? Excellent, excellent. Climate change and plastics don't respect park boundaries. Well, they will flow into your park, right? But why should we still have parks, given that climate change and that's it, right? So fish populations are more resilient. And if you've got, for instance, let's say in your broad population of fish, you've got some that can handle eating plastic a little bit better than others, you'd really rather they stayed in the ocean and reproduced and end up on your plate, right? Protect the seabed but let fishing continue. Well, I've told that joke a couple of times. And where is the evidence? So this is, the reason I put this one up is, as scientists we're often asked to show that something has an effect, but the other side isn't asked to show that it doesn't, right? So there's ideology around that as well. And you can't be in Western Australia and not be told this. There are too many sharks. Response? Yeah, absolutely. And healthy oceans need healthy sharks. And the other one I often say is, well, if there are more fish in the parks, you know, maybe they won't be so hungry. But that's usually not all that helpful. So I just want to close with saying, if you want to go quickly, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So I've been very blessed to have a fantastic team, a number of whom are here tonight, that work with me to make all of this happen. And you can't go very far without money. Ocean research is expensive because you need boats and gear, and so we've been very fortunate as well to have good support both from marine organizations, but this is perhaps my favorite. Shout out for Old Youngs, their gin, handcrafted gin is fantastic. And that's it for me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Fantastic. I'm sure there are some questions. I will start off with one, which is a bit hypothetical. Geograph A is a bit of a disaster, as you said. I saw somewhere recently that the council's behind a proposal to build an underwater observatory at the end of the jetty. Now, is that going to be good for you, or bad for you, or what might the actions need to be taken to make that a success, or is it going to be a failure anyway?
So for those who, at the back, who might not have heard the question, it was basically around, is the idea of an underwater observatory on the Bustleton jetty a good idea or not? I think it's a fantastic idea, because by people going to see the underwater world, and the more people that are exposed to it, including those who don't dive, don't snorkel, that's really good. And they should have appropriate signage to educate people about what's happening with the ocean. The teeny-weeny little sanctuary zone that's around the Bustleton jetty is 1 kilometre in size. That's not going to do much for broader fish populations in the bay. But you will get really good animals around the jetty, because fish are really attracted to structure, which is why artificial reefs that you can fish on are slightly problematic as well. But yeah, no, look, I think, you know, the solution for Geograph Bay is to buy out the net fishing, the commercial net fishing, and to increase the size of the no-take areas.
Sorry.
George?
Did you have one? Yep.
Yeah. Very nice talk. I'm just wondering, do you have any ideas how we can change people's behaviour? Because last week I was at a demonstration of this virtual reality, and they put on the goggles. I went to the Observatory Aborigines, and then I went to the Arctic, and it was really real, you know. And somebody was talking to me, and I turned around and it was Al Gore talking to me. You know, big companies are now in control of information. It used to be what you say. The truth used to be an encyclopedia. And then it became how often you say something must be true. Now, as a virtual reality, you have to find the truth. And I noticed Twiggy's photograph is up there. Why doesn't he change his mind about this Indiana tea room?
Okay, well, no, I'm definitely not going there. That's rather cheeky, Morgan, you know it. The more pertinent question is around how do we change people's behavior. I think you have to hit them, well, one is through education, and I'm a strong believer in that, and it's why I was so delighted to be at C's Eminent speaker this year, because looking at the interest in young people from years 11 and 12 in oceans, I've also been extremely heartened by young people taking up the issue of climate change, and was very delighted to see them wagging school and making their voices heard, including half of my lab, I think. So I think it has to be about education, but there's also other levers that you can pull. So for instance, one of the reasons that, I think I was really pleased when Coles and Woolies got rid of the thin plastic bags. They should have got rid of all of them. But you look at a little while later, people are actually not complaining about it anymore, right? And they're mostly using cloth bags from what I can see at my store. So I think I actually have faith in business making changes that are that will help change behavior because they hit our pocket. And businesses are increasingly concerned about investment, and especially what we call front-facing businesses, where they're dealing with consumers. So I think government will be the last to get on board, but that's why communities need to engage in the political process. We still live in a democracy, mostly.
How do you ensure, particularly with smaller species, that you're not counting the same group of fish?
Excellent question. So what we do is we count the maximum number of individuals on a single frame. So that picture where you saw 164, That was all in one frame. As the analyst goes through the video, if they see an even bigger school, what they guess is bigger, say 220, they'll count all of those, and then we delete. The output only comes out with a maximum number for that species on that video, so we don't double count. For things like sharks, it's a bit of a problem, because sometimes you go, I know those are two different individuals, right? But I never saw them together, so I've only got a count of one. So it is a conservative estimate of abundance, but I think that's much better than overestimating. At the back, all the way at the back, and then...
I saw a presentation as part of the Flame Lab competition, and there was a French chap from, I think, Cuban University that was having a look at the AI, how we're measuring the fish remotely. So he was embedding sort of technology on the sea floor, on reefs, around about the place, and just collecting that data remotely, and you alluded to it. Can you tell us a little bit about how that, is that being coordinated globally to get a bigger picture, to get the big picture?
So coordinating academics is like herding cats. But diversity of approaches is good. So I can think of about 10 research groups around the world that are all working on the issue independently, talking to each other and so on, but taking different approaches to how do we crack this issue. The first step is relatively straightforward. It's identifying an object, and through machine learning you can quickly teach the computer to say that's a 6-stripe grunter or a blue shark or whatever it is. The abundance estimates are a little bit more tricky because of that issue that the gentleman brought up about at what point do you count them, and do you count every single fish and then parse it out. And then the lengths are the trickiest because of the orientation of individuals. And when you're working on reefs, it's particularly challenging because some fish don't move and they look like a rock, right? So at least in the open ocean, we've got a blue background and they're all moving, so it's a much simpler problem. But I reckon we'll crack it in the next 2-3 years. And that will transform our ability to document the status of the oceans. And then there was a question here.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your opinion is on aquaculture and if that would help out similarly.
Yeah. No, aquaculture is incredibly important, and when you look at countries like China, Philippines, Indonesia, they've depended on aquaculture for years through integrated farming. The problem with us Europeans is that instead of wanting to eat at the bottom of the food chain, we eat at the top of the food chain. So we're trying to farm salmon and tuna and all these fish that require other fish. So we end up just feeding them forage species, and we're grinding up fish that could be eaten by people and feeding them to fish for luxury products. So that's the problem with that kind of aquaculture. But I think we must get to a point where we're, in the same way we did with terrestrial food, protein source, was we domesticated animals, but we domesticated them at the bottom of the food chain. We don't farm tigers and bears and lions, right? Apart from the teeth. They'd be really inefficient. So we have to change the way we do it. We have to target species that are at the bottom of the food chain, and we cannot rely on wild fisheries. They're not keeping up. Yep, all the way in the back, and then...
You mentioned that partial protection is not very effective, but have you come across any research that says at least just in the water column that partial protection is somewhat more effective than no protection at all?
So all of the work that's been done on partial protection is from shallow water ecosystems, so temperate and tropical reefs, and typically it shows that you can't tell the difference between a partially protected and an open area. Occasionally you get a slight tick up relative to an area that's open to fishing, but it's nowhere near the outcomes that you get from full protection. And the problem is it's still expensive to manage. In the open ocean, protecting the seabed, which is 3,000 meters below, when everybody's fishing the tuna, isn't going to do much for the tuna. And that's what the partial protection is here. Lynn, I think, had a question, and then Eve.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. As you've already heard, we thought it was wonderful.
we hear a lot on the TV ads for this is a sustainable fishery. What's the definition? Is there any way that we can really think that this is happening? Or is it that it's purely protecting that one species that they are taking from the ocean at that point?
So, important question. When the Marine Stewardship Council was first established to certify fisheries as sustainable, a lot of marine scientists, ecologists like myself were really excited because you'd have some sort of basis for decision making. But what it's turned into is a process where you certify on process rather than outcome. So if people are busy managing, then it's sustainable, even as it crashes. And I remember when Western Rock Lobster crashed, and it was the world's first MSC certified fishery is sustainable. And I said to the head of fisheries, I said, how is it possible that you're telling people are saying it's sustainable when it crashed? And he said, the sign of a well-managed fishery was knowing there was a problem. I kid you not. And, you know, I just sat there and thought, oh man, imagine if you used that argument for bridges. How would that work? Right? Eve, you had a question.
Yes, it was just about recreational fishers. People often say, well, I'll keep two and I'll throw the others back. Just wondered what the survival rate is when you put fish and throw them back.
So it depends on the species. So there's some species like jewfish that are very sensitive to what's called barotrauma. When you haul them up from 30 meters, they basically spit out their swim bladders and their eyes explode. So the probability that they survive that process is quite low. For some of the shark species like hammerheads, they accumulate high levels of lactic acid, like we do when you're out of shape and you go for a run, and it basically kills them. Other species are quite, tiger sharks, like Sweetie, are more resilient and can handle being tossed back. But it's not very clear, and this is one of the problems with bag limits, because as long as you keep fishing, even if you only keep one, the survivorship for most of those species is probably quite low. Sarah in the back?
Great talk, Jessica. Carrying on from the recreational fisheries question, I understand that recreational fishing is perhaps the most popular sport in Australia. Do you think that we have their engagement, their support for marine parks so they protect their future? I mean, that would be a fairly large number group, I thought, if they were on side.
Yeah, so I would say yes. 90% of the recreational fishers I meet get that there's a problem and that their catches are getting lower, the fish are getting harder to catch. And certainly when the Marine Park campaign was being run, a lot of the letters of support that went into government to say, hey, we don't want partial protection, we want a proper network, were from recreational fishers. I think it goes to, one of the challenges is when peak bodies get in the way of civil society. So us as a community might understand what we want and what we think is going on, but when organizations that are paid to lobby become a powerful part of the mix and a powerful voice, that's when politics tends to get a bit wobbly.
What's the minimum size for effective?
Sorry, there's a question up here, and then I'll come back. Jorg, I might leave you till other people have a chance too, yeah. So, yes, you, in the black t-shirt. Yeah, well, black something colored. The mock turtleneck, is it? Okay.
Has any scientific research come out of Cuba? Because Cuba has a phenomenal marine park and a fantastic recreational fishing industry that is 100% catch and release.
Yeah.
And it is not declining, and that's anecdotally, that's why I'm asking you for scientific research.
I actually don't know. I haven't, in scanning the literature, I haven't seen papers coming out of Cuba, and that could be part of their general isolation. That's harder for them to publish. It may also be that if they're publishing in Spanish, no hablo español. My Dutch is pretty good though. So I don't know. The other thing about Cuba is my understanding about their sport fishery is that it's relatively small still because of constraints on travel.
No, it's
Well, compared to the Bahamas?
it's small because there's only one company allowed to do it, so it's managed.
Okay.
I mean, lots of people get there. There's actually a limited number of charters that allow, and that's the government, I think, is restricting recreational fishing.
Because Bahamas is getting absolutely snatched, and that's mostly flowing in from their neighbor, which is a problem that Cuba doesn't have. There was one over here at the back.
Your presentation was amazing, thank you. I'm glad we made it, and I wanted to ask with the education and also the recreational side of things with the fishing. With the young people, in how we can have conversations, with family, friends that do a lot of fishing, and to be mindful of the full protection and to understand the partial protection. But how would you, what would your conversation sound like if you were to speak to a young person? And what you would say to them to sort of have the education, give them the confidence, motivation, etc. To just have conversations, to bring about awareness.
Yeah. So two things. I think the first place you have to start, and I might have gotten a little lost in some of my comments. I actually want people to be able to go fishing. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's healthy. It's outdoors. It's it's a great. Not a big fan of the selfies with dying sharks, but apart from that, dropping a line for herring and so on is a fantastic activity. Teaches people about the oceans. A lot of people in my team have a recreational fishing background, and that's where their passion for oceans comes from. So the way you get to keep fishing is that some areas are set aside, right? That open access everywhere means that eventually they'll disappear. So if you want to keep fishing, you support parks, and this is what we know about how they work. And with kids, depending on their age, talking about how fish change sex, right? And why that matters in terms of how many people knew fish change sex? Okay, most, excellent. Western blue gropers are my favorite. So when you start talking about the quirky nature of fish and what they do and how they live, and making it real for people, then talking about, well, what are the implications for making sure that we keep having fish, right? If you haven't even had a chance to reproduce before you've been caught, what does that mean for having more fish, right? And then you circle around to saying, well, how do you avoid that happening? Well, you have some areas that are protected. I've lost track. So you were in charge.
There's one there, was it?
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a mobile phone. We all use metals. It's about getting the balance right. And it's also about having to spend the money to do the due diligence on what are the implications of what's there, right? So, and I think we let industry off too lightly in terms of due diligence that they need to do before they embark on activities that affect the environment. So I don't think that there should be a blanket ban on it, but I think we need much more control. And interestingly enough, UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea, came in originally because of mining, ocean mining, my recollection. So there was one over here.
Yeah, there's two or three. One there.
Could you give a guesstimate between the funding for marine science, fisheries, and space research and astronomy?
I'm looking forward to going to the moon now. Or Mars. Yeah, it's phenomenal.
It gets a lot more publicity, but is it any use to the people on Earth?
I don't actually know. I mean, if you ask me if I had $1 billion, would I spend it on going to Mars? No, I'd spend it on making the planet we have a better place. People have different motivations. Some of it's driven by exploration and excitement about finding things. Others probably got commercial interests, and so that's a tough one to call. But I wish we invested more in the planet here. I'm going to go over there because he's had his hand up for a while, and then back there.
Yeah, I remember reading about 20 years ago Charles Clover's In the Mine. Remember that?
Yes.
The depressing depressing thing really is not much has actually changed since. The world's largest fleets have diminished for economic reasons, not environmental. It's just, I think, really depressing. Can you just comment on that?
So I think it's changed a lot, actually. Probably not changing fast enough, but 20 years ago, I would not have imagined large marine parks distributed across our oceans. Right? Now, we don't have them right yet, exactly, but we have them, and they're continuing to expand. I would not have imagined an IHG target of 10%, inadequate as it is. We're making progress. I remember, you wouldn't have had a marine biologist drawing a crowd like this 20 years ago, honestly. So the awareness of oceans has changed dramatically. I think plastics, horrific as they are driving a level of ocean awareness that we've never seen before, because people find that really horrific. And that's a good thing too. So, problems aren't solved quickly, but there's much more awareness and action towards things than 20 years ago, I think. And it's because of voices like End of the Line and Daniel Pauly, who was in that, and so on, that are making a difference. And I hope we do. All the way at the back.
Look, thanks for your talk. Which countries are prosecuting the no-take areas most aggressively, and why? And can we take some results of that back to our shores?
So the IHG target has been interesting because all the countries that signed up, which is most of the countries in the world, agreed to put 10% of their EEZs in protected areas. It's not specified what kind. So that's been good generally. But the country that's probably done the best is the UK, with having large no-take protected areas, largely large no-take protected areas around their offshore territories. Why? Because they can feel good because it's not around their own island, close to home. They don't have to deal with their own fisheries and there's hardly anybody there, right? So it's way easier doing things far away. Palau was a very early success story. They created a shark sanctuary, and that was specifically because they knew that all of their tourism was reliant on seeing sharks. They differentiated themselves from other places on that basis. So theirs was a economic differentiation thing. And then for small MPAs, countries like the Philippines, where it really comes down to an issue of food security. And the resources are so depleted that there aren't a lot of choices left. Australia looks good on paper because of all of our habitat protection. And Canada, to my great embarrassment, where I was born, has started converting its fisheries management areas and calling them parks. So they're partially protected marine parks now instead of fisheries management areas. But the point is, once you've got them, you can start monitoring them and you can start pushing for better zoning and better outcomes in them. When you don't have them at all and nobody's got any interest, then what do? So I couldn't drop my cameras in marine parks to show eventual benefits if we didn't have any. There was one young lady up there, if I can take that time.
Yeah, I'll just have this.
Yeah, there.
It just really builds on the last question. I was just curious, when we talk about no-take marine reserves and that target of having 30%, I know that far exceeds the IEG target, and places like the GBR have done well in trying to get their green zones to that level. Are there other places in the world that have gone that far?
So there are parks. So the nice thing about the GBR is it's one single bioregion. So when you achieve 30% no-take in the GBR marine park, you've achieved actually for that bio, or you've exceeded. Then you've achieved the more big goal. There is a really interesting paper that came out by a fellow named Rashid Soumaila, who's from the University of British Columbia. He's one of the top fisheries economists in the world. And he worked with an ecologist, fisheries scientists, and they their papers suggested that if you close the entire high seas to fishing, so all the areas outside of national waters, which go up to 200 nautical miles, if you closed all of that, you would not only have higher fisheries productivity within national waters because the fish do swim over, but you would improve social equity because the people living in those countries would have access to the fish which are otherwise harvested on the high seas by distant water fishing fleets. And just to throw one other comment in on that, anybody know which country, and nobody from my lab can answer that question because we all know it, okay? But anybody know which country harvests or catches the most shark fins in the world for the trade? Shark fins? Spain. Spain. Right? So, you know, we have to think, and it's mostly long-distance fishing fleets, and that's why, you know, bold ideas like closing the high seas to fishing are probably where we need to go.
Okay, thank you, and I'm sorry for those that want another question, they can maybe catch up with Jessica when we finish. There's also the opportunity to attend a lecture in early August during Science Week in Albany that Jessica will be giving if you want to get a question in there.
And I think there's one at the Maritime Museum in September, but I can't quite remember. But so keep your eye out for a flyer. It'll be different again.
Great. Okay. Jessica, you were saying about the size of an effect. Fish swim around. How big does an effective area have to be to detect?
Depends on the species, but certainly these megaparks that are 10,000 square kilometers and greater are a good start.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jessica.